From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, where we assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. Today, once again, your hosts are myself, Elizabeth Ferry, and my colleague and friend John Plotz, who is professor of English at Brandeis University. And Hello, John. And I'm professor of anthropology at Brandeis University. We are joined today by Silvia Bottinelli from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. A native of Tuscany, Silvia Bottinelli started teaching at the museum school in 2010. She is a modern and contemporary art historian in the Visual and Critical Studies Department.
Now, Visual and Material Studies Department.
Visual and Material Studies Department.
Yes.
Welcome, Silvia.
Thank you.
Today we're going to talk about a book that Silvia edited along with Margarita Dayala Valva, and the title of the book is The Taste of Art, Cooking, Food, and Counterculture in Contemporary Practices. And we're going to talk in general about questions related to food as art, art as cuisine, and the ways in which commodities move through the world in order to make food and how those are represented artistically.
Silvia, I think it's such a fascinating topic, and to me, there's so many different ways in, but can I toss out a couple that I would love to talk about?
Absolutely.
And one is, I think, a phrase that you and your co-authors use, which is relational aesthetics, and that's thinking about the process, meaning I understand it as like the making of art, but also the participating in an art event, and that obviously seems to be related to the way in which we associate food with commensuality, eating together, celebrating, like this sort of social dimension.
Food as event.
Right, food as event, right. So that's one side. And then the other side, which I think might be a very long way away, is the materiality of food as object and food as art object. And that, in a way, I'd love to hear about how you see those two spaces intersecting or not intersecting with one another, because the food as object brings up questions that you and your colleagues discuss about sort of materiality and the way in which a food object can be turned into an art object, but but its status as food then kind of becomes problematized by the very fact of being that object. So anyway, just those are like two different dimensions that I saw intersecting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about them.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think the answer is rooted in the meanders of art history.
Yeah.
So starting in the 1960s, artists were willing to question the idea of the canon, but also the traditional mediums of making art. And so they were exploring senses beyond sight as tools to understand and to discover art, not necessarily art objects, but art in general.
Yeah.
And food really lended itself wonderfully to this because it is something that we can look at, but also certainly do experience bodily. And we also, so another aspect that artists were interested in questioning was the idea of the author, right? What is an author? And, ideas of intentionality and exclusivity. The artist as a genius was not really responding well in the 1960s to an idea of a fair society where meaning was constructed in a more kind of democratic way. And so, the idea of art as something that you consume through the body and that's multisensorial was very important, but also the idea of sharing authorship through participation was very important. And so those two dimensions get connected in this critique of what art used to be.
So can I ask, is there some fabulous conceptual art project of the 60s or 70s that's food related that you would talk about? Because I can think of, when you're saying that, my mind is racing through all those Yoko Ono examples.
Absolutely.
But I don't know what the food, I don't know what the food versions of those are. So,
Yoko Ono actually has a piece where she places an apple on top of a pillar, and then the apple is really something that you're invited to again, consume and feel and experience directly. And so that's really part of that Fluxus, moment of the late 50s, early 1960s, where you're trying to substitute the traditional mode of art consumption with something that becomes more experiential. And another artist that was still in New York in the same years that Yoko Ono was, that was interested in the apple specifically, was Alan Capro. And so he created an apple shrine in the basement of the Judson Church, and that was an avant-garde, kind of meeting point. And he created a whole labyrinth out of newspapers and stacks of media stuff that he had accumulated together. And then the viewers had to go through this labyrinth, and then towards the end there was a shrine to the apple with apples that people could actually eat and chew. And the idea there, from a conceptual perspective and also from a happening and performance art perspective, was that we learn so much, or at least we are exposed to so much through the media and newspapers, and the actual presence of the newspapers that were accumulated there were a reminder of that. But that information is just so much and so much to digest that you really don't get anything out of it. You just scroll through it. Exactly. And then you scroll through the stacks of things, and nothing really stays with you. And then in the end, though, you have this other source of information, that's the apple, and that's information that you gather from the actual contact of your body with it, right? Like through the senses, and then you ingest it, and there's something that's left to you, because the apple becomes you, right? Like that's what happens with food. You are what you eat, quite literally as well. And so that's the kind of knowledge that that Capra was trying to foster.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Can I mean, this is a wild connection, but just since I imagine our listeners are thinking about like those older paintings, like beautiful Dutch still lives, in which you just see this utterly luscious lobster. Right? I don't know why I'm thinking of lobster for some reason, or grapes. How would you play out the comparison between that luscious, present but inedible painting versus something like this apple that you're invited to come like fight your way through the art and then eat?
Right. So that's one of the main differences between representational art that basically depicts food and art starting in the 1960s that instead engages with food as material or as a prop for performance, as an opportunity for exchange, that you can actually not eat that painting. But those paintings are important points of reference for artists in subsequent centuries and even for artists that practice today. And in particular, the idea of the vanitas is very strong. The idea that that food that's decaying is a symbol for and a reminder of the fact that everything changes and dies eventually. And in fact, that is connected to an idea of disgust and how this kind of emotions of disgust have a function of reminding us that overabundance is not necessarily something to look for.
Can I pick up on the question about the democratization of this idea of sort of making art more accessible through using food in the 1960s? And just, I guess my background for it is from having written a book about mineral specimens. And one of the things that I found, and this was probably starting in the 1980s, but my guess is the similar process started earlier for food, which is that mineral specimens used to be kind of mostly scientific objects. And then there was a series of projects of different sorts to make them more analogous to art and not to scientific objects. And one of the features of that was to allow them to be much more costly. Because if you're going to say they're like a Rembrandt as opposed to an example of a gillerite or whatever other mineral species, you can obviously charge a lot more money, right? So part of what I got very interested in was sort of the project of making that analogy persuasive, right? And I'm wondering, so maybe not quite at the same time, but somewhere around there, there's also a project of making food and cooking and cuisine into something that, at least at the higher level, has a much more art-like quality, right? And that they're sort of, and partakes of the institutions and the vocabulary and the elitism of the art world where it didn't necessarily in the past. So I'm just curious what you think of that idea.
Yeah, there's a huge complexity regarding the relationship between institutions and the market and art, not only food and art, but art in general, right? And like the first thing that comes to mind, well, first of all, the intentions of the artists that started to embrace food in the 60s were connected exactly to that, undermining the power of the market, because you can't sell, at least they thought, that you couldn't sell an art, a food, item at the same price of a painting. But
Enter the banana and duct tape.
That's exactly right. So that's exactly where I wanted to go. Now this has been completely turned around, because now Mauricio Cattelan just taped a banana at the Miami Art Fair on the wall, and that was, I think, $120,000. And of course, then it was eaten by a performance artist that made a point of saying, I was hungry and this was tasting just like the other 120,000 bananas that you could probably find around Miami. But I think it's a huge, huge question. Artists are on the one hand, always trying to find ways to disentangle themselves from the market. It's hard to generalize, but in many cases, avant-garde artists see themselves as intellectuals that are trying to advance certain concepts, ideas, or critique society in a way or another. But then they're connected to the system of, of fairs and galleries, and they need to sustain themselves, but also that's how the game works. And so there's lots of contradictions there. I would say it's the same with the realm of the university and
the realm of restaurants and
the realm
cuisine,
of restaurants as well.
Right.
And so we've seen starting, I would say 2006 is a good date to refer to, thinking about the time when basically chefs were entering the art world. So Ferran Adrià was invited in 2006 to participate in Documenta in Kassel, and Documenta is one of the major appointments in the art world. It happens every 5 years. It started after World War II and in 55, and it is a very important kind of really meeting point for people that want to observe what's happened in the art world in the past segment of years, and so the presence of Adrià in that context really sanctioned the idea that food and being creative with food could also be understood as a form of art.
Right.
Yeah, but I would love to pursue that more. I allowed myself only one. I have said I was only allowed to bring up Andy Warhol once, but I'm going to play my Andy Warhol card. Can we talk about something
per
like this?
episode or?
Oh, no. Hannah Arendt is on the one per episode. Oops, I just used it up. With Andy Warhol, I was thinking about the soup cans.
Yes.
I mean, could you talk more about that in that same context? Because it's proliferating, it's present everywhere. Somehow by turning it into art, you are framing it. You're just really tired of it. Oh, no.
It's my face.
We don't have to. I'm sorry. I just find him endlessly fascinating. But yeah.
So Andy Warhol started working on the soup cans representations or the representations of food or industrially processed and packaged food in his work starting in the early 1960s. So we're a little bit earlier than Mata Clark's food restaurant. And more or less around the same time, a few years more or less, of Yoko Ono's and Alan Capra's performances with the apples. For Warhol, he really provocatively embraced the idea of industrial production and marketing and advertising and instead of being critical of it, at least on the surface, he really, it really kind of went along with it. And so first of all, representing those soup cans, he is making them into works of art, just like you were mentioning before, Elizabeth, right? Like the very idea of placing something into a gallery, into the realm of the art world, makes it almost more valuable or supposedly sanctions. its importance for society. So that soup can now becomes really put on a pedestal, if you will, quite literally. And then there's the mode of display of those objects or at least those representations of the objects. That's important because they're usually displayed in series where they're really one next to the other, and that elicits references to industrial production once again, right? Like the fact that mass production and manufacturing and
But they're not food art by your definition, right? Because they don't have the food stuff is gone from them. What's there is the lithograph or whatever. Or the
yes, or at least by the definition that we used in the Taste of Art. And then these are really moldable and flexible definitions. I don't believe in labels that are too rigid in general or too that list a certain number of artists and then not others.
But it does seem to have some relationship to those Dutch still lifes as well, right?
Yes.
Because it's about this is the thing which we can all have. In fact, honestly, Elizabeth, if we're going to talk about mince and sweetness and power, it's also like the jam jar in Sidney Mince's account of sugar. Everybody can have sugar.
Yeah.
And the soup can is like everyone can have this comfort. It's not just a lobster for a king anymore. Now,
but they can't necessarily have the print of it. Right?
Yeah, they can't. They can't afford the print, but the print betokens
the print is aware of that.
Comes out of this graphic design background. I hear what you're saying.
Yes.
He's not a satirist. I take that point,
no.
but he's actually upholding the work that somebody did to make the Campbell soup can attractive to you.
Yeah. So Donna Gustafson did write actually an essay about vanitas in pop art, just getting at some of the same conclusions that you're exploring. And it's not only Andy Warhol, but there's many other artists that worked within the pop realm that were exploring this idea of like freezing time, right, and giving that sense of that sense of artificiality almost that goes with the packaging of a food that is organic inside, but that looks completely, steel and almost buried, inside. Yeah,
there's like glorified ephemerality. I mean, I do think there is something to that. Like I know, like in Mince's book, he distinguishes between the sweetness of sugar as the thing that makes it a cheap commodity versus the decorative element of it. But in some weird way, like what Warhol does is he makes the cheap art object, the cheap food object also into...
that's an interesting connection.
Yeah.
So,
but there's something about the substantiality of the food art you guys are talking about in the book and Mince's sculptures, which maybe I'll now introduce. So the second book that we wanted to put on the table was Sidney Mince's Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in... I think its original title was The Place of Sugar in World History. He actually didn't like that title because in fact, the book, although it talks about Asia, doesn't talk that much about Asia. And he often complained because the publishers made him put that in. And whenever anyone would say, but you say it's world and you don't talk about Asia. He's like, I know.
Thanks for that pro tip, Elizabeth. I like that. Who says you don't get value added on a podcast?
That's right. But, that sort of crucial moment. So just as you were saying, Silvia, the, sugar up until the Industrial Revolution, well, in the first place, sweetness there were many vehicles for sweetness, honey, beet sugar, other kinds of things. There were many uses for it, and it was extremely, exclusive in its consumption. And there was the connection to the food art is that there was a type of art, almost like a kind of centerpiece at aristocratic court banquets and the banquets of aristocracy of objects that were made, decorative objects that were made out of sugar. They were known as subtleties. And then when we say things like sugar became much cheaper, well, the reason it became much cheaper was because of the establishment of colonies based on plantation production and enslaved labor, right? So not only is there a big cost, but there's much bigger cost for some people than there is for others, right? And that's kind of the one dimension of Mince's argument. The other dimension of it, which John referred to a few minutes ago, is sort of what makes the argument so brilliant, I think, is that just as, plantations in the colonies were producing sugar and bringing the price down, sugar became much more available to an emerging proletariat as a quick delivery of calories, as something that could be easily added sometimes to other colonial products like tea,
coffee,
and
chocolate.
Yep, and that could make it possible for a emergent proletariat that no longer had a very stable agricultural food source necessarily, and that had to be at the mill at a certain hour. And when men and women were often both working in factories or in other ways.
And in England, right?
And in England, particular, yeah. So that the Industrial Revolution was fueled by sugar in both ways, right? And he describes sugar and other things as proletarian drug foods, right? Because they give you a quick hit of energy, they're fun to eat, they, a little bit of their kind of pleasurable luxury sort of sticks to them still, even though they're now available.
Because we're lucky enough, we were lucky enough to have this conversation because our collaborator, Claire Ogden, had the idea of putting this conversation together, and she is interested in the Futurist Cookbook. And we're going to now have a listen to a little piece of it that she recorded. So, Silvia, do you want to say anything to just introduce us to the Futurist Cookbook? Because I know I've never taught it. I know you have. But
Absolutely, yeah. So the cookbook was one of the many manifestations of the futurist philosophy that was very much about really trying to bring art to all different sorts of levels and make art very much part of life in many dimensions. And so cooking was one that was included in this bigger picture, starting in the early 1930s. So several years after the publication of the Futurist Manifesto. Yeah. But regarding the cookbook, one of the themes that emerges is once again the idea of looking to the future and trying to do things that were really embracing almost, violence, certainly war, and then so it was autarkic in many ways. There was the idea of cultivating the body and the muscles in the body. So, for example, one of the aspects that comes out is the proposal to eliminate pasta from the Italian diet, which is, of course, extremely unsuccessful because it was absolutely contrary to the idea of nation.
My recallable book is all about pasta. So yeah,
there you go.
Okay, great. Well, let's have a listen, and then so we'll listen to Claire Ogden reading from the Futurist Cookbook, and then we will come back and talk more about it.
Nowadays, everyone knows in advance the precise mechanism of events. Family memories, felicitations, and forecasts roll out like newspapers from presses. Our kitchen has banned pasta asciutta. We come to this decision because pasta is made of long, silent, archaeological worms, which weigh down the stomach, make it ill, render it useless. You mustn't introduce these white worms into the body unless you want to make it as closed, dark, and immobile as a museum. These improvised dinners are recommended as a means of bringing together the maximum originality, variety, surprise, unexpectedness, and good humor. Sculpted meat, a synthetic interpretation of the orchards, gardens, and pastures of Italy, is composed of a large cylindrical rissole of minced veal. This cylinder, A, standing upright in the middle of the plate, is crowned with a thick layer of honey, C, and supported at the bottom by a sausage ring, B, which rests on 3 golden spheres of chicken meat, D. A whole salami, skinned, is served upright on a dish containing some very hot black coffee and mixed with a good deal of eau de cologne. These crazy excerpts come from the Futurist Cookbook. In the second wave of futurism, the Futurist Cookbook shocked the Italian nation. It took the prospect of murdering nostalgia as its aim, founding a blasphemous restaurant, the Holy Palate, and publishing an absurd collection of formulas, not recipes, in its cookbook. With the Futurists, dining was a performance. Marinetti also became obsessed with inserting smell and touch into the realm of food. The combination of sensory elements verges on the insane, eating olives in one hand while stroking sandpaper in the other, to what is now commonplace. They called for a scented dish soap, which is standard practice today. Later culinary innovations, like modernist cuisine, can find their origins in futurism's blending of art and science. But the Futurist cookbook, like many manifestos at the time, is full of contradictions. Futurist food was torn between its desire for artistic value and its absolute veneration of the scientific progress of food. As Marinetti said, "We may even prepare mankind for the not-too-distant possibility of broadcasting nourishing waves over the radio." Many of the futurist formulas weren't even nourishing. As Marinetti said, it is better not to have any hunger when tasting these new dishes. In the end, the cookbook has fascist, nationalistic aims. Marinetti hoped that a more aesthetically pleasing diet would modernize the entire Italian nation. So really, the aesthetics of food futurism were a means to an end, a desperate attempt to spread futurism's influence further. Despite futurism's failures to incorporate technology into Italian cuisine at the time, we can see in the Futurist cookbook the avant-garde dissatisfaction with the present and desire for a more creative, innovative future. Futurist ideas about food did have an influence. In molecular gastronomy today, chefs reappropriate the techniques of the theatrical avant-garde to suit a more privileged cultural framework. Food futurism is part of a larger tradition of the struggle to reconcile food's traditions and history with its creative possibilities.
Okay, so many thanks to Claire for that.
You can tell as our sound engineer. Also.
Yes. I know. I liked her futurist motorcycle there.
Yeah.
Marinetti riding away into the sunset.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So can we send some food out over the airwaves? Was that?
That would be revolutionary. Karol Helstowski wrote an essay in The Taste of Art about the Futurist cookbook and really making a point similar to what Claire is making regarding the fact that there's a little bit of one of the ingredients of molecular gastronomy is probably once again, Marinetti and the Futurist cuisine and so there's parallelisms that are analyzed there.
Is there a particular Italian legacy of the Futurists, do you think, that goes through?
I would say, for sure, there's been an impact of futurism on art, contemporary Italian art, and even art in the 1960s. Although the political tones, the ideological tones of the futurist movement were luckily not embraced afterwards. So that's good, that being aligned with fascism or that kind of support of war and violence as important means to really bring the population to a future dimension are clearly not things that more recently artists have supported.
Yeah.
But I would say that Arte Povera, that is another known movement in 20th century Italian art that started in 1967, was initially baptized neo-futurism. It was one of the possible names that critics came up with, and it was still because of the multisensorial dimension, the interest in performance, and the interest in viewing art as something that was more than a sculpture and a painting. And
that's fascinating because actually I was imagining more in line with what you were just saying, something more like an anti-futurist impulse, something like a repudiation. But it's interesting to think about that notion where formal dimensions might nonetheless persist, even though the political iconography of it has to be rejected.
Absolutely. And for Arte Povera, there was a strong interest in food once again. And food as an everyday material, or the kitchen as a space to be explored. And one thing that comes to mind is the work of Marisa Merz, that was an artist based in Turin. She has a show right now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
Yeah.
And her work was very much centered around the kitchen space, and she used aluminum foil that had just become more readily available as a product that people could use to preserve foods, and fridges in the 60s were again starting to be more commonplace in homes, and so she used those, aluminum foils to create sculptures that were extremely light and formed coils, and sometimes sometimes even, took the shape of chairs and really domestic references. And those were basically they occupied all sorts of different spaces in her home. And she has this line that's often quoted where she says she was, tending to her child Bia in the kitchen and also working in the kitchen, and everything was on the same place, on the same level. Both the creative act as well as the child rearing and that's so much in conflict with the idea of the artist as a genius that we were mentioning before was questioned in those years.
Just as a sideline, I mean, aluminum is such an amazing modern material because it's both, the enabler of middle class, domesticity, mid-century domesticity, and also the material that makes skyscrapers possible.
Absolutely.
Right?
And during the fascist...
And airplanes.
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah.
So, absolutely. A material associated with modernity, but at the same time of the private, to the private sphere. And
well, it was sort of gendered modernities, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah. And during the fascist period, it was, going back to Marinetti and, and the context in which the Futurist Cookbook took place. It was, there was a hope that would be an autarkic, metal that could be used for for airplanes or, for infrastructure and skyscrapers or at least, building and, right? So it was really perceived as a possible metal for the future.
Right.
This might be a great time to turn to recallable books.
Yeah, I think so. I have a very short recallable poem. I actually was... Oh,
wow, okay.
I was going to do Potato by Richard Wilbur. Yeah. But when we started talking about Vanitas, I chose another poem in my head, which is a poem written by David Ferry. It is a 2-line poem. Ripeness is all. What rot.
That's great. That's the decay curve right there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's great. Okay.
And to you, John?
Shouldn't we
We
defer
could.
to our guest? So Silvia?
I was going to give her the last word.
Oh,
but
okay. Well.
Yeah.
Okay, so should I go? Yes.
You can thumb wrestle for it.
So I would recommend, I would recall the catalog of a show at the Smart Museum in Chicago titled Feast, Radical Hospitality in Contemporary Art, that was edited by Stephanie Smith. That is a beautifully illustrated book with lots and lots of case studies, both historical and more contemporary, that address everything within the food system, from agriculture and to really food production to consumption and feasts of all sorts. So I think that's one of the most loved books by my students. So I would certainly.
And there'll be a link available on our website.
Great.
This.
Sadly, the way I discovered the book I want to talk about was by finding the obituary of its author, but it's the wonderful Phyllis Prey Bober. Do you know her? She's an ancient food historian, and she wrote a book which I love called Art, Culture, and Cuisine, Ancient and Medieval Gastronomy. But that kind of understates how delightful it is on Roman, extravagant Roman cooking. So I learned about garum, fish sauce, through it, and I discovered some of these amazing feasts. And I also found out, reading her obituary, that she was famous for her class at Bryn Mawr. She would frequently prepare a Roman feast that included an entire wild boar roasted in a college oven. And I don't know about that, but I do know that the book is just amazing on the ways that Romans understood basically luxury and consumption, and how food represented for them a whole set of meanings that I think is very different from ours. And in fact, that's actually also like the book Courtesans and Fish Cakes by Peter Davidson.
Oh, yeah.
Which I
Which
love,
is a wonderful book. Yeah.
Which is about ancient Greek, kind of the democratic impulse to eat fish together. It was the meat that you could eat together that you didn't have to sacrifice to the gods.
Right.
But anyway, I love Phyllis Bober's book, so that's my recommendation.
That's great. I could see connections with the Futurist Cookbook actually there because of the use of honey and meat that was mentioned in one of the recipes that Claire talked about.
Yeah.
So very Roman. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good
Okay,
point.
well, I think it's time for us to thank you, Sylvia, for
Thank you.
coming and chatting with us today. It's been very wide-ranging, and I feel like we could go on for another couple hours.
It
Me
has.
too.
Now I
We'll
really want to have a
restrain
cooking. I want to have a cooking show where we
know.
actually like cook
Yeah, I
over
was
the radio.
thinking, why were we not talking about cooking shows?
You promised that you would speak about food porn at the beginning, so
Food
maybe
porn,
that's
we can
another
get that.
follow-up.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank you.
Recall This Book is the brainchild of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. It is affiliated with Public Books and recorded and edited in the Media Lab of the Brandeis Library by Plotz, Ferry, and a cadre of colleagues in Boston and beyond. Our music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy called Fly Away. Sound editing is by Claire Ogden, and production assistants, including website design and social media, are by Matthew Schratz and Caliska Ross. Mark DeLello oversees and advises on all technological matters, and we appreciate the support of University librarian Matthew Sheehy and Dean Dorothy Hodgson, and of the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions. You can email us directly at ferry or at plotz@brandeis.edu, or you can contact us via social media and our website. If you enjoyed today's show, please be sure to write a review or rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may be interested in checking out past episodes, including topics like new and old media, women and political power, minimalism, or some other angle altogether. Other episodes, which we're calling Recall This Book in Focus, include conversations with Samuel Delaney, Zadie Smith, Mike Lee, and more to come. Thank you very much.